everybody. Welcome. I'm really glad you're here today. We have a special guest for our monthly webinar, Pastor Barry Lehman, and he's here to talk about his book, Mastering Recovery. I've got a copy right here. So Barry here is a Moravian pastor, and he's become a friend of the Center of Addiction and Faith, and he's been to many of our conferences, and he's here today to share some of what he's learned over the years through his own recovery and through this book he's written. So thank you, Barry, for being here today. We have a link in our chat page that will link you right to a place where you can pick that book up. Katie's going to drop that link in the chat page. Today's webinar is recorded. It will be available on our free smartphone app and on our website, along with a huge library of great videos that are also available there. There are about 100 of you registered here today, so we're really excited about that, and we'd love to hear where you're from. If you would put your name and your location in the chat page, we can all see. We'll have to make sure the chat page is enabled. The chat is enabled. It should be, but if it's not, we can fix that. Now, as we get to the end of the webinar, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. So as you think of questions during the presentation today, go ahead and hit the Q&A button and put your question in the queue box. Whoever does that soonest will get their questions answered the first. So you can also use the chat page for that, but it's we're going to attend to the Q&A button mostly. By the way, I'm Pastor Ed Treat. I'm the founder and director of the Center of Addiction and Faith. I'm also a person in long-term recovery. Here at the Center of Addiction and Faith, we work to awaken faith communities to address addiction because it's become such a huge problem. It's the #1 health problem facing the country right now. People are dying. People are dying that didn't want to die. Back in the day when I was taking drugs, it wasn't Russian roulette like it is today. And so we have a lot of people dying that don't want to die, and we need to do something. And church faith communities could and should play a much bigger role in solving this addiction crisis, because I know people that are looking for help will often go to a faith community looking for answers and finding nothing there really to help them. So by better addressing the problem, faith communities would not only save a lot of young lives, but also reduce crime, reduce homelessness, reduce incarceration rates, and so much more, because addiction is tied to nearly every social issue today. It's important we understand it. So before we begin, let's pause now for a moment of silence to call on God and to consider those who suffer from addiction. We'll follow that with the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. An appropriate prayer today, because that's our topic, acceptance. Our webinar host today is George Wood. He is a published author, an ordained minister, pastoral care counselor, a recovery ministry founder, and a recovering activist. George is a former addict and suicide survivor. He's dedicated his life to radically grace-laced, Christ-centered recovery for people struggling with addiction, mental health problems, and suicidal thoughts. George is also an author. He's written The Uncovery and his recently released book, The Uncovery Devotional. And his books can be found in the links that will be in the chat page. George hosts his own podcast called The Sober Truth, and it's soon to be offered through the Center of Addiction and Faith, so be watching for that. So thank you, George. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for hosting today. So grateful for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Pastor Ed. Yeah, it's always an honor to be here, everyone. I am so, thrilled about today. So let me just start by saying this, that, one of the things that the Center of Addiction and Faith does that's so amazing is it has its yearly conference. And I was privileged to go to the last 2 years conference, and both years I happened to, set up a booth for my books right next to today's guest. And during that time, if you've ever been at any type of a conference where people set up a book table, you end up spending about 48 hours right next to each other. And so you tend to really get to know one another. And I have just really been blessed by forming a friendship with today's guest. He's an amazing man. He is a licensed alcohol and drug counselor with almost 30 years experience of his own recovery journey. He has a doctorate of ministry in counseling. He's a retired pastor from the Moravian congregations. He has just been an all-around recovery activist himself. He's, been saving lives for many years now, and he has a wealth of experience. His book, Mastering Recovery, is an incredible resource for those of us in long-term recovery. So many books are written for people trying to get into recovery. There's just not a lot written from a perspective of the people in long-term recovery. How do we get the full transformation out of our recovery? And so I'm going to just turn it over to my friend, Mr. Barry Lehman.
Thank you. I'm touching all buttons here. Let me tell you a story first that I think is going to give us a story of the whole picture of acceptance from my perspective, and it's really what has helped me maintain long-term recovery. It's a joy to be here. George and his wife and I spent a lot of hours standing next to each other and talking. And I would highly recommend both his book and his devotional books. Good stuff in that as well. But the story begins at the end of my senior year in high school. I was the first chair trumpet in our high school band, and I felt pretty good about my abilities. I was a little iffy at times, but anybody in high school probably is, if they're willing to admit it. The day I'm thinking about that this all happened was Memorial Day. And for those of you who are in the United States, you know that Memorial Day is a special day in a lot of places, especially back in 1966 when this was all taking place. It was only 20 years after the end of World War II, and there were lots of names in a small community like mine in Pennsylvania that people knew, who were on those who gave their lives. My father was one of those who fought in the war, but he did not die in the war. He'd been a medic with the 10th Armored Division under General Patton. He had died about 18 months earlier from this Memorial Day of a brain tumor. His grave, along with that of his parents, his brother, and his wife, my mother, was just a couple hundred feet away from where I was standing with the band. As first chair, it was my honor to play taps several times on Memorial Day. I'd already done so by the downtown bridge over the Susquehanna River. That was in honor of the sailors who died. That was a quiet, clear morning, about 8:30 in the morning. All went well. Then the parade up the street to the cemetery. That was a good mile-long parade, mile and a half, up the hills overlooking the wide river. There I was to play taps again for my dad and fellow soldiers. But the rich, clear sound of the early morning was gone. I was only a couple of notes into what is really only a song of 24 notes. My sound wavered, it gurgled. Being not even 18 years old yet, with little experience of what we call performance panic, it didn't get better. It got worse. Now, I assume now, over almost 60 years later, that very few noticed, or if they did, they were nice and gave me the benefit of the doubt. They knew me and my family. They were rooting for me. Me, I was ashamed. I blew it. I hadn't lived up to the moment or whatever my parents' hopes might have been for me. Even as I was finishing playing taps, I said, I guess I'm not as good as I think I am. That was reinforced a couple months later when I was not accepted into the college marching band. I was nervous and thought I'd messed up the audition. Now, later, like 40 years later, a friend of mine said, they didn't need all those trumpets. You just didn't get in. I did get in later. but it convinced me that I was at the end of my trumpet skills. Just accept it and live with it. Isn't that acceptance? Acceptance allowed me at that point, that acceptance allowed me to stay an unexceptional, run-of-the-mill trumpet player. I loved the instrument, I loved playing, and I continued to play. But all my heroes were Maurice Andre, Herb Alpert, Doc Severinsen. They were to listen to. I was not there to try and play like they did. This was true even though I was already the lead trumpet in a Herb Alpert Tijuana brass group and played in a gospel brass quintet. None of that mattered as much as that 65 seconds in the cemetery. Accept it. That's all it's going to be. Live with it. I no longer believe that. And I no longer believe that what I'm talking about there is true acceptance. It isn't acceptance. Maybe you call it surrender. But if it really were acceptance, I have no idea how it could ever keep anyone abstinent, let alone allow any of us to move into long-term sobriety, at least not one that is filled with life. Surrender, though, also has a meaning of moving, as I think acceptance does. And I did move on. I went to college, I went to seminary, was ordained, and I was well suited for it. I loved it. People liked me. I enjoyed preaching, hospital ministry, counseling. But it wasn't my music. I played music, sort of, but I surrendered any possibility of being much better than I was. I gave up. I threw in the towel. I admitted defeat. All such dreams faded away. I became a decent middle to last chair trumpet player in community bands. I knew how to play and was okay at it, but don't give me a solo. I probably wouldn't sleep for days. I didn't give up on the dream, and some other things happened in between all those years. At age 40, 22 years after that Memorial Day in my hometown, I discovered that I was an alcoholic. I discovered that I had a problem with alcohol. Now, talk about a real blow to self-acceptance, self-esteem, identity, and everything I ever thought about myself. After all, I'm a successful pastor in a church in Wisconsin. Thus began, at that point, unknowingly, a path of understanding, experiencing, and living acceptance. Over 30 years later, I don't think those kind of moves happen very easily in the first couple years of sobriety. And I'll talk about more about that later. But at this point, I was still going to meetings 3 to 4 times a week. I was about to start my journey to being a counselor. And in the midst of all that, our church's district over in Wisconsin had a spiritual retreat for clergy and spouses. The leaders were a Roman Catholic bishop from Green Bay and a nun who worked with him as a spiritual director. The second afternoon of the retreat, the sister did a session on the famous stages of death and dying, which originally were developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Most of us are familiar with it. We were sure all familiar with it. It was a great opportunity to hear something for ministry. Talk about denial and anger and depression. Now, I no longer have any recollection, that's quite a few years ago, of how she was building the foundations. But then she summed it up. She looked at all of us and said, well, maybe she looked at me. When you reach the last stage of death and dying, acceptance, you have reached the first step of Alcoholics Anonymous. When you reach the last stage of dying, you're at the first step of AA. Now, that was not a bit of knowledge. It was not a conscious intellectual understanding. It was something far deeper, broader, and more overwhelming. It was a spiritual awakening that to this day for me, still have difficulty putting into words. Although I've been a preacher, I'm pretty good at that. At that moment, it all made complete sense to me. There was a hole in my soul, and I knew it was being filled. I knew acceptance, and acceptance is not giving up. It was living at the end of one way into the beginning of something new. Today, we call acceptance evidence-based. I was pleased to discover more and more research on acceptance. It's the ability to face negative emotions. It allows one to be humble and appreciate what others have. It's not like approving, it's about letting life flow. Today, I am in long-term recovery. What does this have to do with my trumpet playing? Well, that day helped me find a lifestyle that I call recovery. And recovery is at the very center of all that we do. It's called to be the very center of who we are in recovery. As a result, I was fortunate to live long enough in recovery to take the lessons from my new experience and see the difference between giving up and accepting. About 7, 8 years ago, I took a giant leap and went into my discomfort zone about music and my trumpet. I attended 2 retreats in Wisconsin. One was a big band jazz retreat, and the other was a trumpet retreat. I learned some amazing things. I met some amazing people. I began practicing daily, going beyond 20 minutes up to an hour at a time and 2 to 3 hours a day. I've attended those same workshops every year, and I still practice probably 55 out of 60 days. I now play solos in public where other people can hear me. I play in 3 musical groups: jazz band, concert band, and quintet. Acceptance is not giving in or giving up. Acceptance is the wisdom to learn and grow beyond where I am and where I can go. The mental health world has done a lot with the idea of acceptance in all these years. I want to explore that and how we can build that in what we do as people of faith, as counselors, people in recovery, when we ourselves are in recovery or with people who need it. And with that, let me go back here and then I'm going to sum up what I've just talked about and let George then jump in here. What I learned is that living in reality is not the same as giving up. It's about finding a community. I did that with AA and in other ways. I did that with the trumpet community. Acceptance is a personal awareness, a gratitude, and a mindfulness of what's going on. It's discovering goals. It's practicing these principles in all our affairs, and then practicing them some more. It's the ability to discover hope, meaning, and purpose. It's the end and the beginning. George, any questions, any thoughts, or as we look at this basic?
Yeah, thank you so much, Barry. That's really, I never really thought about it in that light. And, I think I've thought of it in more the first light that you mentioned, where, if I accept something, I just sort of let it go in almost in a defeatist way, which is interesting as someone who leads people through 12 steps and has been for years. That's often the very thing that people struggle with, at least the people I've dealt with, where they don't want to just give everything up in a sense of defeating. They're defeated, but the way you just sort of described it, it's not just being defeated and weak. It's a different way. Am I hearing you right in that?
Yeah, that's the puts it so clearly. We don't throw up our hands and say, oh, woe is me. Nothing is ever going to happen. I'm stuck in this, whatever it is, substance use disorder, addiction, alcoholism, take your pick. It's more than that. Acceptance means this is reality. Now, what can I do? And, one of the things that we need to do, I think, is take a look at acceptance from a different angle.
Mm-hmm.
It's an openness, and it's seeing what's happening, awareness, mindfulness. It's the ability to accept situations that are outside of our ability to do anything about. Doesn't mean you like it, but if it's pouring rain out today and I want to go out for a run, or a walk or whatever, I better plan for it. I don't give up and say, oh, I can't do anything. And that's a very simple example.
Yeah, I have one question that keeps going through my mind is how have you used this in helping family members of people in addiction? Because a lot of times, family member will come to me and say, my husband, wife, son, daughter is an alcoholic. I guess I just got to accept that. And almost once again in a defeated way where they just let the person run wild on them because their version of acceptance is anything goes because, that's just them and their addiction. So I guess I have to accept that. So can you give any, advice or maybe a way of spinning that to family members of people in recovery or actually in addiction, not yet in recovery?
Yeah. A couple of things come to mind there, George. One of them is that you are accepting the person. You are accepting the reality that the person has a quote unquote problem. Now, I'm going to talk in a minute here about one of the ways of dealing with that. But the acceptance is saying, yes, there's something going on here that I need to deal with. And it isn't something that I just sit back and wring my hands over. Again, back to the serenity prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. The next part is the courage to change the things I can. And the third is the wisdom to know the difference. When you look at that with this different idea of acceptance is, this is what's going on. This is what I can do. Give me the courage to do it. And let me know what I can and can't do. Can you stop the person from using? No. What can you do in order to help them recognize what's going on? How do you continue to support them? How do you continue to care for them? How do you continue to love them? Whatever words, that's always a starting point. What can you do? And one of those is always, you got to take care of yourself as well. Mm-hmm. Because the day will come when they're going to need your support and you're going to need to be strong enough to give it.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
So there's that idea that I'm not powerless. As powerless is not, I'm weak and I can't do anything. That isn't what serenity prayer says. That's not what the steps say. That's not what the big book says, if you look at it from a 12-step.
Okay. That's good, man. I really appreciate that. Why don't you jump into the next part of your presentation so I don't take all the questions up?
Well, the question is, what gets in the way of true acceptance? And part of it is the disease itself. And we first hear this disease, this thinking process, in statements like these. This isn't fair. Things shouldn't be like this. It's that judgmental question. Even from family members. I didn't do any. I've cared about this person. Why do they treat me like they do? It's that way of taking something and pushing against it as if I just push hard enough, or why do bad things always happen to me? Nobody else ever has to deal with this. Those are not realistic statements. Those are emotional statements. The reality of the emotion is, and emotion is a response to an environment. The reality is this hurts. This is causing a problem. But that doesn't mean that we're stuck there. That's denial. That's what denial is all about. Yeah, but I can't really do anything about it. That's one of the problems with talking about it as a disease. We'll get to that in a second. It's saying, yeah, but if it's a disease, I'm helpless. These are four things that I found over the years. How can I live without this? The only thing I can do is get up in the morning and have a drink or snort a line or smoke a joint. How can I live without that? That's the cognitive dissonance. Or all people who are addicts are bums, or take your pick, all those kind of thoughts. Then there's a fixed versus a growth mindset. And finally, there's the fear of change. What if I don't make it? And that's where mindset comes in. On the left there, these are mindsets which keep us stuck. I'm a victim. I'm hopeless. It's hopeless. I'm lost. Suffering. I don't like it. And I'm incompetent. I'm dependent. To switch to being from a victim to a survivor, to having hope, to being alert to what's going on and aware, autonomous, empowered. That's a word we don't hear enough. It's in the big book. Well, the word isn't, but the example is. For example, talking about powerlessness, we become empowered. We become able to do for ourselves what we couldn't do before because we get help from outside of ourselves. It's that whole process of the community that I talk about.
Yeah, I think, looking at that and just seeing it's almost like a perspective switch, right? Where
Right.
It completely like flipping it upside down. It is repentance in a way. It's a changing of our mind from one direction to the other. But as you were saying, you were going through so many of those, points. I just kept thinking, this is very much the victim mentality of looking at life. As a counselor, how do you really help a person to see? Because a lot of times when a person has a victim mentality, they have that running through their whole entire life. And so do you have any method or way of really helping a person see that that's what they're stuck in?
What I have tended to do working with individuals is to help them begin to define what it is that they are able to do. That's the idea of autonomy, that I am not the victim of things beyond me, there are things going on that I can't control. There are things I can do about it. I can't control the weather, but I can put on another coat, or if it's raining, I can take an umbrella. Too often we look at, and I use this regularly. I guess if I wanted to go outside today and it's pouring rain, I could ask God, keep me dry as I walk across the street. And I assume that God, if God is an all-powerful God, that God can do that. But God's answer to me is going to be, no, I'm not going to do that. You take an umbrella. It's that idea that I am completely powerless over everything, and I need God's help, or I need some help from outside myself. And we often misuse that as well. It gets very complicated. So it's focusing on what can you do? What are you able to do? And it's moving from a fixed mindset, I can do nothing about this, at first beginning to say, what can I do today?
Yeah, that's really good. I just wanted to bring up a point in your book. In chapter 4, you talk about autonomy and mastery. Now, where does it? And you just met, and the reason I thought of this is because you just mentioned that autonomy in your description there. So
Right.
how do you see acceptance and autonomy sort of going hand in hand, side by side, if you will?
Acceptance is the beginning, and of this is the way the world is. This is the way things are in my life at this moment. Now, what am I going to do about that, or what can I do about it? That's where you begin to discover your autonomy. That's where you can begin to discover what you need in order to move beyond where you're at. I once heard this is another disease issue, is cancer. I heard a person who was about to start chemotherapy say that they discovered in talking to their doctor that they were terrified of the chemotherapy, more so than they were of the cancer. And this was their description of it. They were more worried about how sick they were going to be, that this chemotherapy was going to be awful, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out it wasn't real fun, obviously. But they said, the doctor said, stop. The chemo is not your enemy. The chemo is your friend. The chemo is working on your side with you to defeat the cancer.
Mm.
And that person said that completely changed how they looked at what was happening. They no longer focused on the chemo, they focused on the cancer. And that's the acceptance. The cancer is here, but I can do this about it. I can do something about it.
Yeah.
What can you do about addiction? Well, you find a way to move into recovery. Overly simplified, but that's where the autonomy comes in. I can still make decisions. And the longer I'm sober, the more decisions I will be able to make from a healthy perspective.
Do you find, being a person in long-term recovery, that this is still something you struggle with?
Yeah, but it tends to be hidden more today than it used to be. I don't have these great urges to use. That they don't happen. I have no desire to use consciously or unconsciously. I haven't had a using dream on alcohol or drugs in many, many years. I still, believe it or not, have cigarette smoking dreams. That's a powerful one. Oh Lord, and that's been 30 some years too. But yeah, it shows up in the other symptoms. It shows up in the restlessness, irritability, discontent, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, all those words that we throw around in 12-step meetings, which are real. They are how the disease manifests itself in long-term recovery, hoping eventually that you're going to get back into using again. So yeah, it's still there, and you have to pay attention. I don't always pay attention fast enough, but my wife, who's a very observant individual, usually catches me at them.
Would you say, just both, your book and, what we're talking about today, is, you talk about strength and vulnerability, but do you think you can build resilience in becoming acceptance, like being good at it? Like,
yes, that's a place to move on here, because I think I switched to the next slide here. Building acceptance. How do we overcome that? First of all, I think it's essential for any of us. I fight back and forth with myself whether the disease model or the redefining powerlessness should come first. They probably are pretty equal. It depends on where you are. I start with redefining powerlessness. Powerlessness means there are things that I cannot control. It doesn't mean I can't change. And it's, as I talked about, the wisdom of knowing what to change. So how do we learn that? One of the ways, I think, is through the process of recovery, what we call recovery. We build our self-esteem. Every time you do something, I think every time you go to a meeting and you walk out and you haven't used that day, your self-esteem, you should stop and say, wow, thank you, I did that. and that's the autonomy. Doing things. You made the decision to go to the meeting. This is in early recovery. Early recovery, the first 2 years, it's a struggle because, and this is the flip side of that, the disease model. I have a disease. I am not a bad person. I am not a bum. I'm not whatever. I may have made a lot of dumb decisions. I may have made decisions based on inappropriate thinking. But I have a disease. I'm not a bad person. We're still fighting the stigma of alcoholism and addiction. It's not as bad as it was when I got sober, I don't think, although it's kind of bubbling back up again with the whole fentanyl and opioid crisis. I see some things happening that are taking us some steps backwards, but it shouldn't. We need to focus on the brain science, and those of us who work in the field are at a place we're still back in the 60s, if you want to compare where we are in treating addiction with where cancer was back in the 60s, cancer therapy was. We don't know. It's a lot we don't know. And it's far, far more complicated, and I think we're far closer. The next thing, what helps is watching others who do get better. Being in touch with people that's the community. With my trumpet playing, I got to know people who were my age, who were picking up the trumpet for the first time and playing it. It was a community and I learned things from them. And then I got support from them. That's what helps in overcoming. That's where it starts in those first 2 years. Early recovery, 2 years. Discovering recovery can and does work. It's in those first 2 years that you build new routines and habits. And third is you clean and clear the past. What this does is it rewire. We use the phrase rewires the brain. The brain is very plastic. The brain is very malleable. It really does rebuild itself in ways that are amazing, miraculous. And in those first 2 years, that's our focus. I don't like to use the term mastery with people in the first 2 years, because I know if I'd have heard that in the first 2 years, I thought, oh, gee, if I just get all this done in the next 6 days, I'm going to be a master at recovery. When in reality, it takes 2 years. And then long-term recovery, after those 2 years, we're discovering that if you keep doing what you've been doing, that the habits that worked, you build recovery as a lifestyle. But there will also be the ups and downs, and that's where you need to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think that's, I'm just sitting here right now, and even in long-term recovery, thinking, acceptance, having personal struggles and not realizing that part of the challenge, like the frustration, is I'm actually not accepting what's happening and looking at what I can do. I'm just stuck on the frustration of what didn't go my way. And so there's so much to be said about building this up, right?
Right. That's the acceptance. And what you just described is learning how to do that beyond just my recovery. And recovery isn't one small part of my life. Recovery has to be the basis, the foundation, the blueprint for everything I do. That's recovery. It's essential. And we have to learn how to apply acceptance to those things as well. That can be tough. That's one of the reasons why things happen. The epidemic, the pandemic over those years, there was a lot of relapse happening with the disease because people got stuck. And I'm not judging them. This is a powerful disease. Substance use disorder is powerful. Has a lot going for it, unfortunately. And when you get those real times of stress, like the pandemic was, like times of bad health of any kind, like somebody's death or in an accident, sudden death, those kind of things that they hit us, those are when we want to go back to the way we used to do it.
Mm.
Acceptance is a way of getting in the way of that.
What would you say? Just I see Pastor Ed may be about to jump on, but I have a question. And what we talked about it in regards to step one, but what other steps would you most say acceptance is applicable to?
uh, it's gonna sound like I'm copying out. There isn't a step that is not accepted, that isn't applied to. I mean, even looking at the 11th step, that where that you say that you need to do certain things on a regular basis, 10, 11, and 12. Those are the maintenance steps. Having 12, having had a spiritual awakening. Well, and my spiritual awakening is still there. Am I still feeling like? And the acceptance is, well, the acceptance becomes, I am no longer where I was when I started this program.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm only doing what I did then, expecting it to do what it did then, it's not going to do everything because I'm not the same person.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to look at that acceptance. A change is part of life. You have to look and say, I'm different today. Of course I'm different. For one thing, and in my recovery, I'm 35 years older.
Mm-hmm.
That means I'm not as strong as I used to be. I have physical issues that I didn't have when I was 40, that are absolutely normal.
Mm-hmm.
But if I get upset at that and want to say, I can't accept that, well, okay, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I almost think that, acceptance, is not just a recovery principle. It's really a principle that, most human beings should go through.
Oh, you're right. I know Ed probably wants to jump in here. Hey, how about that? Chime me. And then I want to run through these things that show about how this all fits together.
Thanks. Thank you for this. It's fascinating. Thank you, Barry and George. This is, I was thinking about acceptance and how that applies to my life. And I was thinking about my decision to form the Center of Addiction and Faith. I was working as a pastor for 25 years, and I had kind of given up on the church in terms of it dealing with the issue of addiction. I just saw the church wasn't really interested, and there was nothing I could do to get the church interested. So I kind of gave up on that. And accepted it. But I find it unacceptable and realized that I do have the power to make a change. And so in 2020, I made the decision to leave the parish ministry and start this organization called the Center of Addiction and Faith in an effort to try to get faith communities to step up and start doing some things. This is the #1 health crisis facing the country. It's devastating lives and communities, and the implications spread out from there. But we're all paying a price for it. And there are things we can do. The problem, you mentioned we're dealing with this with really old, like 1960s thinking. Most of our culture is still ignorant about addiction. And for me to think about the seminary sending out faith leaders to lead people without any understanding of addiction and how it works in our lives, to me seems crazy. It just seems like addiction and what it does to people is a model for what sin does to everyone. And it's what we're learning about addiction is really valuable for those who are in faith and want to grow in faith. The 12 steps has revealed to us some really practical ways that we can grow and accept things and learn to be the kind of people Jesus wants us to be. So I left the parish, and I decided I was going to make a change, and I took a step of faith, the courage to change the things I can. And I thought God would just open up the coffers and provide for every bit of need that we might have. And I have come to find out that's not the way it's working. We are constantly trying to figure out how to pay for this ministry and keep it going. I came to the point where I was thinking I'm going to have to either give it up and go back into the parish, or I don't know, figure out something. And I just finally accepted that this is my calling in life, and whether I get compensated or we have the resources to do everything we need doesn't matter. I just have to do this because this is my calling. And so part of that calling requires me to beg for money. And so I'm doing that now. I need your support. I need your help. Everything we're doing costs money to function in the real world. And so if you're one of those people that likes what we're doing and thinks it matters and thinks it's important, I'd invite you to give, and especially this week, because we have a generous member who has agreed to match dollar for dollar every gift that we get. So if you would, there's links in the chat page. If you could be a sustaining member with a small monthly gift, that's great, or a one-time gift, or anything you can do. Maybe your church has a foundation that you could tell me about that I could write to and make an appeal. Any ways that you can think that might help the Center of Addiction and Faith would be so greatly appreciated. We're doing some really good work, and we'd like to keep it going. So that's my ad. If you have questions for George or for Barry or George, please post them in the chat page. We'll go back to the webinar now and listen to Barry answer questions. Turn it back over to you guys.
Okay. I'm going to do a quick 4 slides and then open it up. And this will be, if you will, an ad. We're going to be doing a book study, which Ed will have at the end. But this is the mastery process. Mastery is a process that applies to anything, period. It's a way of getting better at something that's important. It has 3, there's the autonomy part of it, the first phase. The second phase is working at it. And the third phase is finding the purpose. As you build on this, you do it with things like inventory and setting goals. Those of you in 12-step program know how this works. It's so essential. And I love that line. What is the one thing that if I do it, everything else will be easier? And then the setting goals. So the process of building acceptance is be consistent, keep it enjoyable, find support and feedback, review and inventory, and keep the cycle going. And here's one way of looking at it in a very simple 4-phase process. This is what it's all about. Discover your skills and goals, practice and grow them, live with purpose and gratitude, celebrate and go deeper. And then once you get there, you start through it again and you grow. You keep getting better at something that's important to you. And in this case, sobriety. So that's what my book is about in a lot more depth than that. And I'm also building other things. I have a newsletter that goes out every week on Wednesdays. And this is important to me. I want people to, in long-term recovery, if you're in your first 2 years of sobriety, keep working on that. Don't jump into mastery. Keep working and building what you got.
So there's a question in here that comes from Don Taystad, and he says there was a gentleman named Vern Johnson. He was a pastor here in the Twin Cities. Right. He developed a family intervention model that could raise the bottom for many people. Are there family interventions happening today? Are you aware of?
Actually, I'm on. Okay, I'm still on mute.
No, you're good.
Okay. I'm not aware of any organization that does it. That doesn't mean they're not out there. I see something down here in the chat. Maybe that's a place. I'm still doing part-time work in the first 2 years, actually in the first 4 weeks with people. I work in primary recovery still, so I'm not aware of organizations, but that's an important one. Thank you for raising that. Vern Johnson is, of course, one of the heroes of our field.
Mm-hmm. And there are individuals who do interventions that specialize in that, and they usually are connected to some treatment center that's supporting them.
Right.
Otto Schultz is somebody who does family interventions, and he has a model that he's going to be actually teaching on. We're going to get him on a webinar, but he just mentioned in the comments, yes, the intervention model we use has grown from the Johnson model. And he's happy to share the template for intervention conversations. Thanks, Otto. That's generous. Appreciate that. And hopefully at our next conference, we'll have a workshop with Otto in there helping people understand some of that. I have a question, and that is, um, I know someone who struggles with politics and world events and global warming and wars in Ukraine and wars in Gaza and um, just the condition of the world today is just such a mess, and she struggles with how to accept it because it drives her crazy, and I think I would say it drives me crazy too. Some things that are pretty unacceptable, but what can I do?
Now you're getting into the heavy duty part of it, unfortunately. And I've spent a lot of time pondering that in the past few years as well. So, what can I do about the situation in the world? Well, that's where you begin to try to figure out where can you do something. Think globally, act locally is one of those phrases that's often used. How can I make the world I'm living in a better place? I accept that the world is crazy. At this moment, there's wars. I can't stop the war in Gaza. I can't stop the war in Ukraine. What I can do is make it a better place for the people around me. That's been my way of looking at that. The wisdom to know the difference, and sometimes the courage to actually step out and do that.
Mm.
Mm. Yeah, that's really good.
So one of the other things that I have trouble accepting is the state of overdoses today, the growing number of overdoses, and the lack of treatment and resources for people. I think only 1% of people who need treatment will get it. And so I think part of the problem is that our society is still working, as you mentioned, with really old information. I mean, we still think about it in really old ways. It's like we have new science now and we have solutions now, but most of them are unknown. And so that's one of the things that I think, as Center of Addiction and Faith deals with, and I'm sure can relate. How do we fix that? It's not acceptable, but what can we do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would go back to the Center of Addiction and Faith and say what this organization is set up to do is exactly what is needed. Educating, offering a way of support. When I discovered you guys, talk about George and I had our booth next to each other. Well, the one year I had a booth next at another conference, I had a booth next to Ed, and that's how I got connected with this organization. So pay attention to what's going on around you. The other piece I think is really how can we in the church provide the education, the resources, the support. Sometimes it's the clergy, sometimes it's others. And I don't mean just opening your doors to have an AA meet in your building. That's one way, but that's not it. That doesn't change how we think about it. So I think this was actually what I worked on my doctoral program in at Lutheran School, Chicago. It was in how does the church do this, and it's not an easy thing because we don't want to risk stepping on toes. We're afraid that if we talk about it, some people will want to go out and drink. If we talk too much about drugs, the kids will want to use it. All those kind of things that just aren't true. But rather giving a good education. And for those of us in the faith community, the awareness that there is help from others like us, from others who support the program, and from a higher power that we are connected with and can continue to be connected with. For some of us, that higher power is the God that we understand through the Christian faith. For others, it may be through the Jewish faith or the Islamic faith, or it may be the wonders of nature. Take your pick. But it's that connection to some things that are greater than us. And that's the spiritual side. And that's something we can do something about and we can talk about in the faith community.
Well, I think of that parable of the little boy on the beach with the starfish, tossing them back in, and was asked, what difference do you think you can make? And he says, well, it matters to this one. And he throws it back into the water. So we can make a difference.
If you want to read that whole story, it's not a parable. It really happened to a guy named Lauren Isley. And the story is in a book called The Star Thrower. And he wrote that 60 years ago.
Wow.
It's quite a story. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I just want to say this, that 290 people in our country die by overdose every week. And, that does not even include those that were drunk or high and caused an auto accident where lives were lost. And in almost every autopsy, there's, prescription medication and a combination of drugs. And so we look at, statistics like that. And the one thing we can't do is put our head in the sand and think it's going to get better. We have to look to the resources of those, find organizations that are doing the work and doing it well. And, that is the Center of Addiction and Faith. There's, and whoever else you may find out there. But to put your head in the sand is a complete mistake. You have to look at, the one thing you can do, and that's find people that you trust, find people that are doing the work, and then support them. And I think that that's, one of the mistakes that is made is the bystander theory, which, happened many years ago in New York City when that person was assaulted and no one helped. And they figured out psychologically that when a major trauma is transpiring, that everybody thinks somebody else is going to do something about it. But the reality is that no one ends up doing anything about it. And that's been the state of the church for far too long. And so we need to get off our butts and get in touch with the people that are doing the work and make a difference. And not be afraid of stepping on toes. And not be afraid of pissing people off, because it needs to be. People are dying at a rate unprecedented before. Substance abuse it's unimaginable the amount of people that are dying to substance abuse.
Yeah. Even as we speak, I know from my own personal experience that, and I know this is really true of a lot of people with addiction, is you can't save yourself. That's what denial is all about. You really need somebody to intervene and get in your face. And that's what happened to me. Somebody got in my face. And so we need to learn how to do that appropriately to get in people's faces. It's an act of love. So we're down to our last couple of minutes. I'm going to do a couple of announcements before I let you all go. My great thanks to Barry Lehman, for the work that you're doing, for your book, and for all that you're doing to deal with this problem. Thank you for Mastering Recovery and for all the ways that you continue to labor away at this field. Today's webinar is recorded. It will be available on our free smartphone app and on our website, along with a huge library of other great videos. Pastor Barry is offering a 4-week book study on his book, Mastering Recovery. It starts Tuesday, April 16th at noon Central. It'll be in 4 segments. There's a link in the chat page, and maybe I could have our producer, Katie, put that link back in there for the book study registration before people get out of here. And then our annual conference this year is coming up in October, and this year the conference will be entirely virtual. So I hope you'll make plans to be there, and we'll have a lot of great resources to inspire, educate, and equip faith communities for how to do effective recovery addiction awareness ministry. Next month, our webinar will feature Rose Ann Forte. She's the author of the book, The Plans He Has for Me. She helps people change their relationship with alcohol and other toxic substances so they can free themselves of the psychological slavery of their excessive use problem. And so her work is focusing on people who aren't really bad enough to go to treatment or 12-step group, but have have a drinking problem, maybe not alcoholism, or they're using excessively and want to dial it back. There's a huge segment of our population that struggles with that. And so her materials are a really great gift for learning how to do that. And she uses a lot of scripture, and it's a spiritual approach. It's a faith-based approach. Her webinar registration is in the chat page. And if it's not there, I'm going to put it there again. There you go. Any last words before we go? It's 1 o'clock. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, George. Blessings to you. And this is a great topic for this week because we celebrate Easter, death, and resurrection. And Barry, you kind of said that acceptance is about dying. It's about dying and rising. So a great theme. So lots of thank you emojis popping up on my website. So thank you so much, and God bless you. Go in peace. Serve the Lord.